nations directly help developing countries to get out of the poverty trap, to increase their standards of living. So we'll begin with the direct aid. Direct aid is a situation when a country sends direct help, directly helps the poor country to overcome the poverty. So United States and some other advanced economies have assisted developing nations directly. So they do it through a variety of programs and through participation in international bodies that are designed to stimulate economic development. So we either devote part of our budget to help the foreign nations, developing foreign nations, or we do that through some kind of a international organizations that collect the money and then distribute it to the countries that are still developing. So this aid usually amounts to about 1/4 of 1% of a collective GDP of the high-income countries that year. So to put it in the other perspective, imagine that you're making $100 a day, and a quarter, so 25 cents, goes towards helping poor nations. So in a way, it's probably not going to break your budget in a way. So even that's the only source of your income, you're still probably still capable of helping those that are in more need. So here we're not discussing whether or not we should be helping the other nations, but rather what we actually do. So if you make $100 a day and you send a quarter of a dollar or 25 cents to help the poor, that's pretty much equivalent to what United States sends to the other countries. So a large portion of foreign aid is distributed on the basis of political and military rather than strictly economic considerations. So a lot of times United States is, or other countries are more motivated by the political process rather than who actually needs that money more. For example, Israel, Turkey, Egypt, Greece, and Pakistan are major recipients of United States aid. And as we know, those countries are not among those with the lowest standard of living. So most of our aid goes to actually countries where political process dictates the help. Asian, Latin American, and African nations with much lower standards of living receive much less than the countries discussed above. Some of the world's poorest nations receive large amounts of foreign aid relative to their mere GDP. What does it mean? Well, countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Nicaragua, Eritrea, all of those receive in foreign aid almost as much as they make their own. So, for example, Liberia, we can see, receive 54% of the foreign aid relative to their GDP. So imagine that a person is making $10 an hour and that person gets $5 in addition to that for pretty much nothing. So just as a help to somebody else. But of course, in cases of those countries, the standards of living is so low that without this additional help, people would not have any access to basic necessities. Another way to help the countries is actually through the international organization. And one of those organizations is the World Bank. So let's talk a little bit about World Bank Group. So major objective of World Bank Group is helping developing nations to achieve economic growth. So that's what World Bank is trying to achieve, to help out those developing countries to prosper. It's supported by about 185 member nations. The World Bank is not only lends out its capital funds but also sell bonds and lends the proceeds and guarantees and insures private loans. So there's many functions that World Bank is going to have. So first of all, if countries need to borrow capital, as we said, that poor countries don't have their own savings to invest it in either physical or human capital. They can borrow the funds from World Bank. World Bank also sell bonds, meaning that it's another form of loan, and lends the proceeds and guarantees that private loans are going to happen. So in a way, World Bank is the last resort lending agency. Its loans are limited to economic projects for which private funds are not readily available. So a country must first apply for some kind of a private funds, try to raise private resources to invest them in the physical or human capital. And if they're not successful, as we said with the poorest nations, then the World Bank can help. So many World Bank loans have been for basic development projects such as dams, irrigation process, health and sanitation programs, communications and transportation facilities. So once again, we are building the infrastructure in extremely poor areas in order for it to become at least somewhat attractive for the private investor. The bank also helped finance the infrastructure that needed to encourage the flow of private capital, which is what we just said. So all of this is pretty much with the purpose of starting to attract the private investors. The bank has provided technical assistance to developing countries by helping them determine what avenues of growth seem appropriate for their economic development. So what's happening there? Well, first of all, some of the poorest nations, they simply don't have enough knowledge of how to get out of the poverty trap. They may not necessarily know what needs to be done in order for the residents to become to gain a higher standard of living. So in this way, World Bank can help to guide them through this process of developing. And it may actually help them determine some avenues of growth. Since many countries are different, since each one of them have their own morals to a point, their own traditions and things like that, there's no single rule that's going to determine what's going to get them out of poverty. So the World Bank can help to kind of master this avenue of growth, to kind of make it match the country's specific situation, and that will allow the country to grow on their own and become successful. Well, along with the help, either direct help or the World Bank help, we also need to discuss something that we call foreign harm. As we said with many things, even though the intentions may be great, they may not necessarily result in what was intended. So results are not the same as intentions. So this could be related to those unintended consequences, and that's of foreign help, and that's what we'll call foreign harm. First of all, foreign aid can create dependency and reduce incentives for countries to get out of the trap on their own. So foreign aid may promote dependency rather than self-sustaining growth. Developing nations may ignore painful economic decisions, the institutional and cultural reforms, and the changes in attitude toward thrift, industry, hard work, and self-reliance that are needed for economic growth. After some 5 decades, demand for foreign aid had increased rather than decreased. So that's a problem. So we can see that countries, instead of trying to become independent in a way of figuring out the low standards of living, trying to figure out the way to get out of the poverty trap, they actually become so dependent on the other nations that they no longer seek the ways to get out of the negative situation that exists in their country. So they're not trying to become self-reliant and rather depend on the other countries. And we can observe that by increased demand for the foreign aid. So countries not necessarily ask for less, but rather ask for more. So if aid programs have been successful, we should have seen the opposite, but we don't. It also can create bureaucracy and centralized government. Usually, aid is given to governments, not to the residents or businesses. So whenever we talk about large sums of money being transferred from developed nation into the developing nations, of course government is the recipient, and we rely on the foreign government to distribute that money onto the residents. That not always is the case. Aid may generate massive inefficient government bureaucracy and centralized government power over the economy. So in many developing countries, especially in the case of the Soviet Union, we can see post-Soviet Union countries. So there was a lot of aid that going to those countries. But that aid was how to use that aid, how to use that money was decided by the government officials. And of course, not necessarily that aid was directed towards the residents or towards to improving the conditions, but rather somehow was directed to the projects that somehow benefited the government officials. So we're talking about cases of corruptions, we're talking about cases of ineffective government bureaucracies. As a result, the residents of the country did not see any benefits from that foreign aid, but it actually government officials were becoming more rich and gaining more and more government power. So aid often shifts the nation's focus from producing more output to bickering over how unearned income should be distributed. So now those government officials are not finding necessarily what's the best way to use that money to improve the conditions in the country, but they're fighting about who needs to get which projects. So a lot of times, as we talked about crony capitalism, the bureaucracy, the government officials would hire their own relatives, hire their friends to complete some projects which may not be necessarily the most efficient projects. And last, corruption and misuse. Aid is being used ineffectively. Some estimates suggest that from 10 to 20% of the aid is delivered to government officials. So here we're talking about directly. So government officials somehow manage through crony capitalism, through making the projects through their relatives or friends. Let's say I give you this project, you pay me in return, right? So in a way, this aid goes towards some project, hope somebody benefits from it, but they share the profits with that particular government official, even though it sounds almost impossible in the United States, but in many countries that's how it works. Aid consultants and multinational corporations are major beneficiaries of aid programs, and a lot of times that this aid not necessarily, as we said, benefits the residents, but rather large corporations that don't need that aid to start with. Many corporations, either in the developing nations or actually in those that already developed and send in the help, many corporations in both of those countries are major recipients of those aid and major beneficiaries of foreign aid. So we're going to watch a small video that kind of makes fun a little bit, of course, to a point of the situation with foreign aid, and we can see who considers to be who receives the benefits and who thinks about these benefits, who thinks about the purpose of those benefits. So let's watch the following video and then we'll continue on to the foreign aid.